By the time Wyatt Sorrell tasted the stew, he had already decided no stranger belonged in his kitchen. He stood in the doorway with rain on the brim of his hat, mud on his boots, and a feed sack still hanging from one shoulder. The room in front of him looked wrong. Clean table, fire in the stove, a pot simmering low, and a woman he had never seen before standing beside it with her sleeves rolled to her elbows and flour dusted across one wrist. Wyatt looked at the bowl set near his father's chair. His father's chair had been empty for most of 3 years. "Who made this?" he asked. The woman did not step back. She did not lower her eyes either. "I did. You were not supposed to be in my kitchen." "No," she said. "I expect not." That answer stopped him more than fear would have. Most people explained too much when they were caught where they were not wanted. This woman only stood there, tired and straight, with one hand resting near the edge of the stove as if she knew better than to reach for anything that was not hers. Her name was June Whitlock. 2 days earlier, she had stepped down from the stagecoach in Dry Hollow Crossing with one carpetbag, one folded letter, and the last of her hope buttoned under a plain brown coat. The town had one main street, a mercantile, a blacksmith shop, a church with a weathered steeple, and a saloon whose doors never stopped moving in the wind. June had not come for any of that. She had come for Percy Leland. His letters had been steady, not sweet, not poetic, just steady enough to make a woman believe there might be a clean room, a shared table, and a place where her name did not sound like a burden. After her father died, June's brothers sold what was left of the farm. She cooked in other people's kitchens, slept in rooms that belonged to someone else, and learned to thank folks for space they never truly gave her. Percy had written one line she carried all the way west: "You will not be unwanted here." So she stood in front of Crane Mercantile and waited. The clerk came out instead. He was young, red-eared, and holding an envelope like it might bite him. "Miss Whitlock." "Yes." "Mr. Leland asked me to give you this." June looked past him to the mercantile window. A curtain moved. Someone was watching from inside. "Where is Mr. Leland?" The clerk swallowed. "He ain't coming out." The street kept moving around her. A wagon rolled by. A horse shook rein from its mane. Somewhere near the blacksmith shop, a hammer struck iron twice, then stopped. The clerk pushed the envelope toward her. "Mr. Leland says there has been a change. He married Miss Elsa Harrow last Friday. Her father owns the North Meadow lease. And things got settled quick." Last Friday, June had been sitting in a stagecoach with dust in her mouth, thinking every mile was carrying her closer to being chosen. She looked at the envelope. What is inside? Enough for a ticket back. Irekon. Back. There was no back. There was only a sold farm, a brother's house with no room for her, and the small shame of discovering that even rejection could arrive folded in paper. June took the envelope, because refusing it would only make the windows stare harder. "Tell Mr. Leland I received his message." The clerk looked relieved to be dismissed. Across the street, Wyatt Sorrell stood beside a wagon loaded with oats, fence wire, and a new hinge for the barn door. He had come to town for supplies, not trouble, but he saw the way June held herself. She did not cry. She did not shout. She did not beg the coward behind the curtain to come out and speak his own words. She only stood there with a carpetbag at her feet and one hand near the pocket where that envelope sat like an insult. Wyatt knew that kind of silence. It lived in his house. His mother had been gone 3 years, and his father, Abram Sorrell, had been disappearing ever since. Sorrell Creek Ranch still ran because Wyatt made it run. But the house had become a cold place where coffee burned, bread hardened, and no one said May Sorrell's name unless grief forced it out. Wyatt crossed the street. "Ma'am," he said, touching the brim of his hat. "I heard enough to know you were treated poorly." Her eyes sharpened. "Then you heard more than you had a right to." "That may be true. Are you here to offer pity?" "No," Wyatt said. "I do not have much use for it." She studied him. He glanced toward the low clouds gathering over the eastern ridge. "I run a ranch 5 miles out. My father is unwell. The house needs cooking, cleaning, mending, and patience. I can pay wages, $8 a month. Room and board. June said nothing. It is honest work. He added, nothing more. That last part mattered. He saw that it mattered. June looked once at the mercantile window. The curtain moved again. If I come, she said, I work for wages. I keep my own room. And if I choose to leave, I leave. Fair. And I do not belong to any man who mistakes kindness for ownership. Wyatt met her eyes fully. No woman should. So June Whitlock lifted her carpetbag from the mud and climbed into Wyatt Sorrell's wagon. She did not know then that before sundown, she would sweep old ashes from his stove, find beef bones in the cold box, cut onions thin, stretch salt pork with potatoes, and set biscuits in the oven. She did not know the smell would move down the hallway and stop outside Abram Sorrell's locked door. She did not know an old man would open that door 1 inch. And she did not know that when Wyatt came home and found stew in a house that had forgotten how to be hungry, he would be angry only because Hope had walked in without asking permission. By morning, the plate outside Abram Sorrell's door was empty. June found it sitting against the wall. Not washed, not clean, but empty, except for a smear of onion, gravy, and 2 biscuit crumbs. She stood there with the plate in both hands. A closed door could say no. An empty plate said something else. Behind her, Wyatt stepped out of his room, buttoning his work shirt. He stopped when he saw what she was holding. For a moment, neither of them spoke. He ate, Wyatt asked. Some. Wyatt looked toward the door at the end of the hall. First time in 2 days. June carried the plate to the kitchen and washed it in warm water. Then today we try again. He watched her dry it and set it on the shelf. His face did not soften much. Men like Wyatt Sorrell did not soften quickly. But something in his eyes had shifted. Like a latch lifting inside a locked room. I'll be riding the south fence, he said. Storm took a post down near the creek. You need breakfast first. I can take coffee. You can take eggs too. If the hens are still laying. He stared at her like no one had spoken to him that way in years. There are hens, he said. Red one bites. I have met worse than a hen. The corner of his mouth moved. Not a smile. The memory of one. The chicken coop sat behind the shed, half sheltered from the wind by a leaning stack of old boards. June gathered 4 eggs and took 1 sharp peck from the red hen without giving the bird the satisfaction of a complaint. By the time Wyatt left, he had eaten eggs fried in bacon grease, yesterday's biscuits split and warmed on the stove, and coffee strong enough to float a horseshoe. June wrapped 2 biscuits in a clean cloth and handed them to him at the door. For later. I don't need feeding twice. I'm not feeding you twice. I'm saving myself from dragging a stubborn man off the ground before supper. His eyes lifted to hers. A quiet passed between them. Not warm enough to be trust. Not cold enough to be nothing. Much obliged, he said, and tucked the cloth inside his coat. After he rode out, June began with the kitchen. She did not try to fix the whole house. A house that had been grieving for 3 years could not be scolded back into life by noon. She swept the floor, emptied the ashpan, scrubbed the table until pale wood showed through old stains, and opened the window just long enough to let in the smell of wet grass, horses, and rain coming off the ridge. Then she took her small cloth pouch from her carpet bag. Inside were dried sage, thyme, bay leaf, a pinch of rosemary, and a folded paper of cracked black pepper. Her mother had taught her that poor food did not have to taste poor. A woman could make comfort out of bones if she knew patience. June found beef bones in the cold box, potatoes in the cellar, 2 tired carrots wrapped in cloth, and a heel of salt pork. She browned the bones in a heavy pot, added onion, herbs, water, and a little pepper, then let it settle into a slow simmer. The smell did not rush. It moved through the house carefully. like it knew some rooms needed asking. Near midday, June heard the shift behind Abram's door. A bed creaked. A cough followed. Then silence. She kept stirring. When Wyatt came back at noon, rain had darkened his coat and mud climbed halfway up his boots. He stopped just inside the kitchen. The first thing he did was breathe in. He tried to hide it. June saw. "What is that?" he asked. "Stew." "With what meat?" "Mostly bones." His brow lowered. "Bones don't smell like that." "They do, if they are treated kindly." Wyatt looked at the pot, then at the clean table, then down the hall toward his father's door. The house was still plain, the shelf still cracked, the chairs still mismatched, but the air no longer felt abandoned. June ladled him a bowl and set bread beside it. He took one spoonful, stopped. Rain tapped softly against the window. "My mother made something like this," he said. June kept her hands busy folding the breadcloth. A good stew belongs to every mother who had more love than money. Wyatt did not answer. His throat moved once. She looked away and let him have the silence. After he finished, June filled a smaller bowl, covered it with a cloth, and walked down the hall. She knocked softly. "Mr. Sorrell, there is stew today. I will leave it here if you want some." This time, before she set the bowl down, a voice came through the wood. Rough, thin, unused. "Who are you?" June's hand tightened on the bowl. "My name is June Whitlock." "What are you doing in my house?" "Working for your son." A long pause. "He does not know how to hire help." "From the kitchen." Wyatt sat very still. "No," June said gently, "but he knows when help is needed." She set the bowl down and returned to the kitchen. That evening, when she went to collect it, the bowl was empty. Beside it lay a small brass button, old, dull, pressed with the shape of wheat stalks bending in wind. June picked it up and turned it in her fingers. Wyatt came down the hall behind her and stopped. "Where did you get that?" It was beside the bowl. He took one slow step closer. "That was my mother's," he said. From behind the closed door, Abram Sorrell began to weep. Not loudly, not for pity, just one broken sound after another, like an old barn giving way under snow. June knelt beside the door and placed the brass wheat button on her open palm. "Mr. Sorrell," she said softly, "I believe this belongs to your family." The door opened 1 inch. A pale hand reached out. A gray eye looked through the shadow. Abram took the button and held it against his chest. "I thought I lost all the small things," he whispered. June kept her voice low. Small things are usually the last to leave a house. Behind her, Wyatt looked away, because some truths did not cut deep by being sharp. They cut deep by being kind. Wyatt found the letter under Percy Leland's elbow. It sat on the counter at Crane Mercantile, half covered by a gloved hand, with June Whitlock written across the front in dark ink. Wyatt had come for flour, coffee, lamp oil, salt, and a sack of oats. Nothing more. He had left Sorrel Creek before noon with June's supply list folded in his shirt pocket, and the memory of his father holding that brass wheat button like it still had warmth in it. The bell above the mercantile door gave a dry little ring when he stepped inside. Voices lowered. Not enough to hide. Percy Leland stood near the counter in a fine gray vest, one boot polished, one hand resting too carefully over the letter. Otto Crane, the storekeeper, was weighing coffee beans behind the register and watching the room through old eyes that missed little. Percy smiled. "Buying for your new cook." "Sorrell?" Wyatt handed June's list to Otto. "Filling an order. I heard she knows her way around a stove." Percy's smile sharpened. "Good thing, considering she had nowhere else to go." The mercantile went still. A man near the seed sacks pretended to read the label on a barrel. Another looked down at his boots. Wyatt turned his head slowly. "She has a name." Percy's smile thinned. "I know her name." "Then use it with respect." Percy's face reddened. "You have taken a strong interest in a woman you hired 2 days ago." Wyatt stepped close enough that Percy stopped smiling altogether. "You gave your word to a woman," Wyatt said, low and plain, then hid behind a clerk when it was time to break it. "Do not mistake my interest for the strange part of this." Otto Crane set the coffee sack down without a sound. Percy's hand shifted. That was when Wyatt saw the letter clearly. June Whitlock. Not from Percy's hand. The writing was rougher. Hurried. Slanted hard to the right. "That belongs to Miss Whitlock," Wyatt said. Percy laid his palm flat over it. "It came care of my store. Then your store can hand it over." For a moment, Percy looked like he might refuse. Then he noticed Otto watching him. He noticed the men by the seed sacks listening too hard. He lifted the letter with 2 fingers and slid it across the counter like the paper had gone sour. Wyatt picked it up and tucked it inside his coat. He paid for the supplies, loaded the wagon, and rode home with the letter resting against his chest like a coal that would not cool. At Sorrell Creek Ranch, June was taking sheets from the clothesline before the evening damp settled. Her sleeves were rolled, her hair pinned low, and a streak of flour marked one cheek. "You were gone long," she said. Town was talkative. That is seldom useful. "No." He pulled the letter from his coat. "This was at Crane's. Had your name on it?" June's face changed before she touched it. Not fear, recognition. Where was it? Near Percy Leland. Her fingers closed around the paper. Wyatt wanted to ask who had written it. He wanted to ask why Percy had kept it. But the letter was hers. And a man did not earn trust by reaching into another person's hurt. "I'll unload," he said. June stepped toward the cottonwood beside the house and broke the seal where the last light could still reach. The letter was from Noah, her younger brother. "Dear June, I do not know if this will reach you before you leave Missouri. I am writing because I cannot bear what was done. Malcolm sold the last of Father's tools and the good mule. He said there was no room for you and no sense pretending otherwise." June stopped reading. The yard blurred once, then steadied. She forced herself on. "He had already answered Mr. Leland before you ever saw the letter. Malcolm told him you had estate money coming after the farm was settled. There is no money. There never was. I think that is why he wanted you gone before you learned the truth." June pressed the paper against her skirt. Not chosen. Sent. There was a difference. Both cut. She read the final lines. "If you find work there, do not come back for our sake. Come back only if you want to. You deserve better than all of us. Your brother, Noah." By the time she finished, the sky had gone gray over the barn roof. Wyatt came out carrying the last empty crate. He saw her face and set it down. "June." She looked at him. "I was not sent west to be married," she said quietly. "I was sent west to be gotten rid of." Wyatt removed his hat. He had no polished words, only the truth in front of him. "You are not something to be gotten rid of." A bitter little smile touched her mouth and vanished. "My brother and Mr. Leland seem to have disagreed. They were wrong. The answer was too plain to defend against." June looked toward the kitchen window where lamplight had begun to glow. Inside, Abram called out, asking whether Supper had decided to walk back to Missouri. It should have made her laugh. It nearly made her cry. That night, she cooked as if nothing had happened. Beans with molasses, corn cakes and bacon grease, fried apples, because Abram had asked if there was anything sweet left in the world. But her eyes were different, guarded. After supper, while Wyatt checked the horses, Abram turned the brass wheat button between his fingers. "You got bad news," he said. June dried a plate. "News I should have known sooner. The worst kind." She stood still a moment. "Does it ever stop hurting?" "Mr. Sorrell, being unwanted by people who should have cared." Abram looked toward the stove. "No," he said, "but one day, if God is kind, somebody wants you right. Then the old hurt still sits there, but it does not get the whole room." June folded Noah's letter and slipped it into her Bible. Only later, by lamplight, did she notice the line written on the back? Small, crowded near the bottom, Ask Leland about the receipt. By breakfast, June had read the line 6 times. Ask Leland about the receipt. The corn cakes browned too dark on one side before Abram cleared his throat from the table. You are thinking loud again. June turned the cake with a fork. I did not know thoughts made smoke. They do when they burn breakfast. Wyatt reached for the pan before she could. Their hands nearly met over the stove. June drew hers back. Not sharply, but enough for him to notice. He said nothing about it. That was becoming one of the things she trusted in him. At the table, she placed Noah's letter between Wyatt and Abram and pointed to the line on the back. Wyatt read it once. His jaw tightened. I'll ask Leland. No, June said. He looked up. The word had come out firmer than she expected. But she did not take it back. No, she repeated. If the receipt is about my name, I will ask. Abram leaned back with the brass wheat button beside his coffee cup. She has the right of it. Wyatt looked toward his father. Percy will twist it. Then she ought to bring a man who hears straight. Abram said. June almost smiled. Wyatt did not. But after a moment, he folded the letter and handed it back to her. All right. That meant more than a promise. By noon, the wagon was hitched. Abram insisted on coming until he reached the porch and had to grip the rail. His breath caught hard enough to settle the argument for him. June touched his sleeve. Stay here. I need you at the table when we come back. I do not take orders from hired help. You do today. The old man stared at her, then gave a dry sound that might have once been a laugh. He reached into his pocket and pressed the brass wheat button into her palm. For courage. June closed her fingers around it. I will bring it back. You better. It is one of the few fine things this house has left. Dry Hollow Crossing looked different when June rode in beside Wyatt. 2 days earlier, she had stood there with shame in her pocket and no place to put her feet. Now she stepped down from the wagon holding her Bible, Noah's letter tucked inside it, and Abram Sorrell's brass button warm in her glove. Faces turned. The blacksmith paused at his anvil. A woman outside the church leaned closer to another woman and whispered. June did not lower her eyes. Percy Leland stood behind the counter of Crane Mercantile when they entered. His face tightened before he arranged it into courtesy. Miss Whitlock, he said, this is unexpected. I have a question. His gaze moved to Wyatt. Does your employer speak for you now? No, June said. That is why I am speaking. Otto Crane stood behind the counter. Old shoulders bent. Eyes clear. June placed Noah's letter flat on the wood. My brother says there was a receipt. Percy's fingers twitched. Small. Enough. A receipt for what? Mr. Leland. Percy straightened his vest. I do not know what your family business has to do with me. You had my letter. It was sent care of the store. And kept care of your counter. Otto Crane's mouth moved. But he said nothing yet. June's voice stayed even, though her heart was beating hard enough to shake her ribs. Did my brother Malcolm take money from you? Percy looked toward the door as if hoping the street might save him. At last, he said. There was an understanding. What understanding? He leaned forward and lowered his voice. Your brother wrote that you had a share coming from your father's farm. He said if I paid for your travel and sent a small advance, that money would come after marriage. The store seemed to grow colder. How much? June asked. Percy did not answer. Wyatt's voice came low from beside her. How much? Percy swallowed. $50. $50. More money than June had held at one time in her life. Enough to buy a mule. Enough to pay a season's wages. Enough to turn a sister into a bargain. June looked at Percy and finally understood. He had not left her because she was plain, poor, late, or unwanted. He had left her because the money had not followed. Do you have the receipt? She asked. No. A floorboard creaked behind the counter. Otto Crane reached beneath it and lifted a narrow account book. Worn at the corners. Yes, the old storekeeper said. He does. Percy spun toward him. Crane. Otto opened the book. Men can make dirty arrangements under my roof if they must. But they do not get to pretend I cannot write. He turned the book around. There it was in black ink. Malcolm Whitlock. $50, advance for marriage settlement. Paid by Percy Leland. Witnessed at Crane Mercantile. June stared at the line. Her life had been written smaller than the price of a horse. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Percy said, "If there was deceit, it came from your brother, not me." June lifted her eyes. "You let me come all this way." His face sharpened. "I changed my mind about marriage. No law against that." "No," she said. "Only shame." A soft sound came from the doorway. Everyone turned. Elsa Leland stood there in a pale traveling coat. One gloved hand pressed against her middle. "Percy," she said. "What money?" His face went white around the mouth. "Elsa, go home." She did not move. "You told my father the note was for store repairs." Percy's silence answered too much. June looked at Elsa then, and the anger in her shifted shape. This woman was not the winner June had imagined. She was another name Percy had placed beside money. Otto tore a copy sheet from the back of the book and gave it to June. "If Leland or your brother tries to lay that debt on you, show this to any lawman with sense." Percy reached for it. Wyatt stepped between them. No blow. No threat. Just enough man in the way. June folded the copy and placed it inside her Bible. When they left the mercantile, no one in Dry Hollow Crossing laughed. That was not justice yet, but it was the first sound of a town learning where to look. Noah Whitlock rode into Sorrell Creek after dark, with mud up to his knees and guilt sitting plain on his face. June heard the horse before she saw him. She was in the kitchen, folding the receipt copy into her Bible. When the animal stopped outside the porch rail, Wyatt rose from the table at once. Abram, wrapped in his quilt near the stove, lifted his head like an old dog, hearing weather turn. A man's voice came through the door. "I am looking for June Whitlock." June went still. Wyatt crossed to the door but did not open it right away. "State your business." The rider answered, tired and rough. "My name is Noah Whitlock. I am her brother." The room changed around her. June stood slowly. The Bible stayed under her hand. "Let him in," she said. Wyatt opened the door. Noah stepped inside with his hat in both hands. He was younger than June by several years. Lean from hard travel, with the same brown eyes and the same sorrowful mouth. He looked at the clean kitchen, the stove, the breadcloth on the table, Abram in his chair, Wyatt by the door. Then he looked at June. "I am sorry," he said. The words were small, too small. June kept her voice quiet. "You should be." Noah nodded as if he deserved worse. "I know." Abram shifted in his chair. "Boy, if you rode all this way, carrying only sorry, you should have saved the horse." Noah reached into his coat and took out a damp packet tied with string. "I brought proof." Wyatt came closer. June did not move. Noah laid the papers on the table one by one. A letter from Aunt Cora saying June never handled any estate money. A banknote showing the farm had been sold to cover old debt. A page from Malcolm's own hand, naming Percy Leland and the $50 advance. Then Noah placed down the last paper. June saw her name at the bottom. Only she had not written it. The letters tried to look like hers. They curved where hers stood straight. The first stroke of the J was too weak. The whole name looked like it wanted to hide from itself. "What is that?" she asked. Noah swallowed. "A statement saying you agreed to bring payment after marriage." The stove clicked. Outside, rain began tapping on the porch roof. "Malcolm signed my name," June said. "Yes." Wyatt's face hardened. He did not touch the paper. That restraint told June more than anger would have. Noah looked down. "He is coming." Percy wrote to him, "After you arrived. Malcolm cannot repay the $50. He means to swear you agreed to the debt." Abram's old eyes sharpened. "And Pike. Leland," June said softly. Abram grunted. "Same breed." Is he waiting for Malcolm? Noah nodded. In town? Or close? A hard knock struck the front door before anyone could answer. 3 blows. Not neighborly. Official. Wyatt turned. Another voice called from the porch. Wyatt Sorrell. Open up. I have business regarding June Whitlock. June felt the old cold come up through her feet. Wyatt looked at her. Do you want them inside? She looked at Noah. Then at the forged name on the table. Then at Abram, who had pushed himself straighter in his chair. Trouble left outside could grow teeth in the dark. Yes, she said. Let them in. Wyatt opened the door. Percy Leland stood there in his fine coat, rain darkening the shoulders. Beside him was Malcolm Whitlock, clean-booted and hard-eyed, wearing the face of a man who had already decided his own comfort mattered more than blood. Deputy Rafe Crowe stood behind them with water dripping from his hat brim, looking like he wished the road had washed out before they reached the ranch. Percy stepped in first. Miss Whitlock entered into an agreement. We are here to settle it peaceably. No, June said. You are here because the receipt was found. Malcolm's eyes cut to Noah. You always did run your mouth. Noah flinched, but did not sit down. June looked at Malcolm. Did you sign my name? His jaw tightened. You knew enough. No. You wanted a home. I found you one. You sold a promise you had no right to make. Percy laid his own paper on the table. This says otherwise. Deputy Crowe leaned toward the forged statement. June's heart beat hard, but she did not step back. Noah pulled another folded sheet from inside his vest. This is June's true hand. A letter she wrote to Aunt Cora before leaving Missouri. He placed it beside the false statement. The room held still. Deputy Crowe took both pages closer to the lamp. His eyes moved from one signature to the other. The false name looked soft and narrow. The true one stood clean. The J strong. The W steady. Every letter made by a woman, taught to put herself plainly on paper. These do not match, the deputy said. Malcolm's face reddened. Women changed their hand. Abram's voice came from the stove. Not their backbone. Percy tried to gather the papers. Wyatt stepped between his hand and the table. No blow. Just a line drawn. Deputy Crowe lifted a hand. Nobody takes these tonight. This goes before Sheriff Briggs in the morning. Percy looked at June with cold dislike. You will regret making this public. June picked up her Bible and held it against her chest. No, she said. I regret letting men whisper over my name for this long. If you have ever believed a good name is worth standing for, stay with June now. Morning in Dry Hollow Crossing would decide whether truth stayed in a kitchen or walked into town where everyone could see it. After the men left, the house did not relax. June stood at the table, one hand over the true signature and one over the false. Wyatt came near. Close enough for warmth? Not close enough to crowd. You do not have to face them tomorrow, he said. Yes, June answered. I do. Her voice was quiet, but the name on the paper was hers again. At dawn. The wagon rolled toward Dry Hollow, crossing under a sky, the color of cold pewter. June sat between Wyatt and Noah with her Bible in her lap. Inside it were the receipt copy from Crane Mercantile, Noah's letter, the true signature from Aunt Cora's kitchen drawer, and the forged paper Malcolm had carried into Sorrel Creek like a loaded thing. Abram rode in the back, wrapped in his quilt. Stubborn as a fence post in winter mud. You should have stayed home, Wyatt said without turning. Abram coughed once. And miss, seeing liars, learn scripture. Not a chance. June almost smiled. Almost. By the time they reached town, people had gathered near the church steps. Percy Leland stood beside Malcolm Whitlock, both dressed too neatly for men who had slept poorly. Deputy Crowe waited near the hitching rail, and beside the church door stood Sheriff Amos Briggs, square-built, gray-bearded, with the kind of face that did not hurry toward anyone's version of truth. Then June saw Elsa Leland. Percy's new wife stood a little apart from him, pale under hair bonnet, holding a locked tin box against her chest. Percy turned when he noticed her. Elsa, Go home. She did not move. Sheriff Briggs stepped down from the church porch. Mrs. Leland says there is more to be heard. Percy's eyes hardened. My wife is upset. Elsa looked at June. Then, at the people watching from porches, wagon seats, and shop doors. I am upset, she said, but not confused. She set the tin box on the church step and opened it with a small key tied to a ribbon at her wrist. Inside were folded letters, bank papers, and a thin account sheet wrapped in cloth. Percy took one step. Wyatt moved only half a step, but it was enough to make him stop. Elsa handed the first letter to the sheriff. This is from Percy to Malcolm Whitlock, she said. It says he would marry June only if estate money followed within 30 days. A murmur moved through the street. June stood very still. The words did not break her now. They only named the wound. Sheriff Briggs read the letter, then looked at Percy. Your hand. Percy said nothing. Elsa took out another page. This is the banknote my father signed. Percy told us it was for store repairs after the spring storm, but the dates match the $50 he sent Malcolm. Otto Crane came from the mercantile carrying his account book, and my record matches it. Sheriff Briggs laid all the papers together on the church step. Malcolm Whitlock, he said, did you sign your sister's name to this statement? Malcolm's face flushed. She knew what was intended. That is not what I asked. Noah stepped forward, shaking but upright. Tell the truth for once. Malcolm glared at him. You always were weak. No, Noah said. I was weak when I stayed quiet. The street went silent. Malcolm looked at June then, and for one moment she saw not a brother, not even an enemy, but a small man trapped under the weight of what he had chosen. Yes, he said at last. I signed it. June closed her eyes for one breath. The lie was dead. Sheriff Briggs gathered the papers. June Whitlock owes no debt to Percy Leland, Malcolm Whitlock, or any other man in this matter. Any claim made against her name is false. The words crossed dry hollow like a clean wind. Not loud. Enough. Percy tried to speak, but Elsa had already stepped away from him. My father will settle what law requires, she said, but I will not share a table with a man who prices women before he names them. Percy looked around for support. He found lowered eyes. That was not prison. Not yet. But it was consequence. Wounded pride could survive many things. Being seen clearly was not one of them. By noon, the matter was written proper at Sheriff Briggs's office. Otto signed his statement. Noah signed his. Elsa signed hers with a hand that trembled only at the end. Malcolm was ordered to remain in town until the circuit judge came through. The forged signature would not be treated as family confusion. Not anymore. Percy was made to sign a written withdrawal of any claim against June Whitlock. Sheriff Briggs kept one copy. Otto Crane kept another behind the mercantile counter where the bargain had first been hidden. Then Otto said it plainly, in front of 3 witnesses. My store sells flour, coffee, nails, and feed. It does not sell women under the counter. No one laughed. That made it better. Justice did not always need applause. Sometimes it only needed ink, witnesses, and a door closing behind the right man. When June stepped outside the sheriff's office, Mrs. Vale from the boarding house approached with her hands folded tight. I should have offered you a room that first day, she said. June looked at her. The old hurt rose, then settled. Maybe next time, June said. You will. It was not punishment. It was a boundary. They rode back to Sorrell Creek under a clearing sky. Noah rode behind, quiet but no longer hiding. Abram held the brass wheat button in his palm all the way home. At the ranch, June went first to the kitchen, not because work was all she had. Because the room was waiting, the stove was cold, the table needed wiping. The kettle sat where she had left it, dull and ordinary. Asking nothing but use, Wyatt stopped in the doorway. You do not have to stay, he said. June set her Bible on the table. The receipt, the true signature, the sheriff's written note, and Percy's withdrawal rested inside it. I know. You have your name cleared. Yes. You have proof enough to go anywhere that will take honest work. He reached into his coat and placed $8 on the table. June looked at the coins. What is that? Your wages. Wyatt said. Earned before today. Before any choosing. The room grew very quiet. Abram looked down at the brass wheat button and said nothing. June touched the edge of one coin with her finger. Money enough for a boarding house. Money enough for a stage ticket partway out. Money enough to prove she was not trapped. She turned toward Wyatt. And if I stay, his hand tightened once on the doorframe. Then you stay because you choose to. June looked at the stove. The chair where Abram sat now more often than not. The shelf where the brass wheat button lay beside the salt crock, and the man who had stood beside her without stepping in front. I choose to, she said. The words did not make a grand thing of themselves. They simply belonged. That evening, she made stew again. Beef bones, onion, potatoes, pepper, thyme, and enough patience to soften what had been hard too long. Abram ate at the table. Noah washed the bowls. Wyatt split kindling by the back door and came in smelling of rain and cedar. After supper, Noah stood beside the wagon with his hat in his hands. I cannot fix what Malcolm did, he said. June looked at him for a long moment. No, she said. You cannot. His shoulders dropped. But you told the truth when it cost you something. She added, start there. Noah nodded once. And for the first time since he arrived, he looked less like a boy running from guilt and more like a man willing to carry it properly. Before bed, June placed the kettle on the stove and set her Bible beside it. Not hidden in a bag, not clutched like a shield. On the table, where a thing with her name in it could rest. Outside, the last light faded over Sorrel Creek Ranch. Inside, the house smelled of bread, coffee, and stew. Not fixed, not finished, but wanted. This is a fictional story created for entertainment. Any resemblance to real people, places, or events is purely coincidental.